Hi, how's it going? This is the DP200, Yeswelder's new dual pulse MIG welder. It's also a multi-process machine, so it can do stick and lift start TIG. There's a lot to get through and a lot of testing I want to do, so this video will be a bit light on interface details. Lots of other videos go over the interface at length, so I'll just talk about the highlights. It has a large color screen that lets you go through all the various settings and the different processes, and it even has a built-in user manual, which is kind of nice, I suppose. They tout simplicity for beginners, and I suppose that's true. It is a synergic MIG welder. It does let you tweak the voltage up or down from whatever the synergic setting puts it at, but it doesn't have a full manual mode where you can just freely set the wire feed speed and voltage. When selecting the process, it has graphics on screen showing how to configure the welder for each one, which is also handy for a beginner. I do think an argument could be made that a basic machine with a knob for wire speed, a knob for voltage, and a chart printed on the case with starting points for various situations might actually be a bit simpler than clicking and turning through different knobs and menus and with all the different settings and options this machine has. But maybe I'm just old. Still, it does seem like effort was made to keep everything simple and well explained, all right in the menu system. And obviously this machine's main claim to fame is that it has not only pulse MIG, but also dual pulse MIG. I'm going to be testing the machine out pretty thoroughly, and if I find anything that doesn't make sense or doesn't work, I'll let you know. And if you want a full walkthrough video of the interface and all the settings, let me know. The fan does seem to be temperature controlled. I don't think it ever shuts off completely, but it does slow down to a very quiet hum. The included accessories are pretty typical for Yeswelder. The stick electrode holder isn't stamped steel, but it is very light duty, and the handle literally snapped off the very first time I tried to squeeze it. The work clamp isn't the worst ever, but it is basic, flimsy stamped steel. The cables are aluminum with insulation that melts when it touches hot metal, which you might imagine isn't ideal for welding cables. On the plus side, the little jumper on the front of the welder is nicer than the one on the MiG 205DS that I recently started checking out as well. The one on the DP200 is plenty long, and it is a copper cable with decent insulation. Copper is a better conductor and it's more durable. The one on the MiG 205DS is the same aluminum with poor insulation that the weld cables are, and it's short enough to make plugging it into the further port a little bit of a challenge. The MIG gun that comes with this welder is a pretty typical, inexpensive welder MIG gun. It's fine, but it's nothing special. I also ordered a TIG foot pedal for this machine, but it hasn't arrived yet, and in fact I don't have a tracking number or anything yet even, so I'm not going to probably be doing a lot of TIG welding in this video. I'll save the TIG testing for once I have the foot pedal. I also ordered a MIG consumables kit, which hasn't shipped yet either, which is unfortunate because this machine comes with 2 rolls of 030 wire, and it comes with 5 or 6 035 contact tips, but only a single 030-inch contact tip. It's not a huge deal, but it is something to be aware of. The common Tweco-style contact tips that are available pretty much everywhere do thread into this MIG gun, but they are smaller than the tips that it comes with, so I'll try one and let you know how well it works, but it's obviously not exactly what it's supposed to have. Let's open the welder up and take a look inside before we get to the testing. So I've got the machine opened up, and right off the bat, I do see some things that I like. Obviously, I haven't done any intensive safety testing or insulation breakdown tests or anything like that, but I do like that the ground wire on the power cord comes in and bolts directly to the case on a stud inside and uses a flared nut, and they've removed the paint on the inside, and they've used a star washer to cut through the paint on the outside. So they have actually done the work and gone through the effort to make sure that the ground cable has a nice solid electrical connection to the case, and that's good to see. Very likely this review video will come out first, but I am kind of simultaneously going through the MiG 205DS welder, the updated machine that I got recently. And one of the main problems that I had with the inside of that machine was that it had some of the worst grounding of any machine I've seen. So the fact that this one did a pretty good job of it is definitely good to see. I also like that the board is facing in, so You don't have the high voltage live components right up next to the outer case. They are inside, and they are on pretty tall standoffs, so they're not very close to the inside case either. So just in terms of this machine being able to short out internally from the case getting bumped or dented from the outside, much less likely than with a lot of other machines. The positive output terminal is sort of close to the outer case, which that would be a problem if that shorted out, but it probably wouldn't be all that much of a safety concern, more so just an issue with damaging the machine. All of the tall and or heavy components seem to be pretty well supported, either by actual physical brackets or just by a ton of that celastic material to keep them from vibrating or coming loose. So that's nice also. I also see some things that bode well for the output, at least potentially. It has 4 input capacitors. It has a much bigger and beefier transformer than a lot of their machines have. It has 2 input rectifiers. And it has a little bit more heat sinking than some of their machines do, and it's arranged pretty nicely with multiple fans, so, assuming everything works like it should stay nice and cool as well. There's also a CT around one of the output cables, so it seems to be monitoring the output current, maybe just for overload protection, but it could even display it on the screen while welding, so we'll see. I haven't dug into it super deep, but it does seem to be one of the better made Yeswelder machines that I've looked at. Let's get it back together and do some welding with it. Just a few notes before I talk about performance. I did try one of those commonly available contact tips and it worked fine. Just to be aware that they are a bit smaller, so they may not hold up as well. The data tag on the machine seems to be accurate in terms of listed outputs, but the specs page in the manual has some inaccuracies. In fact, even some of the instructions in the manual are wrong. For instance, some of the steps on replacing the MIG gun liner with the graphite liner, the picture doesn't match the text, stuff like that. Basically, it needs to be proofread and edited, but the manual is still better than when some other welders didn't even include manuals. I also found an odd quirk on the interface. When you switch voltages, all of the settings return to factory defaults. I can shut the machine off and even unplug it, and when I come back the next day, if I plug it into the same voltage, when I turn it on, all the settings will be the way I left them. But if I switch voltage at any time, when I turn the machine back on, it's back to factory defaults, including the interface being back to dark mode if I'd changed it to light mode. Not a big deal, but it might be a bug they want to address. As for output, I'm happy to report that in every mode I tried, on 120 volts and 240 volts, the unit has the amount of output claimed, and the setting was pretty accurate even in MIG mode. MIG is constant voltage, not constant amperage, so it's normal for the amperage to vary, but it can hit the claimed output, and in general, if you dial in 130 amps, you'll get around 130 amps. It also shows the actual current in real time while welding, and that's fairly accurate as well. So, marvel of marvels, Yeswelder did it. They created an accurately rated machine. In fact, in MIG mode, when you manually adjust the settings outside of the synergic range, you can actually hit higher than the rated output. For instance, when running on 120 volts with the welder set on what it considered max, I manually cranked the wire feed speed up, and the machine actually went up to about 150 amps of output for a few seconds before cutting out on overload protection. I dialed the setting back down to the synergic setting, and it happily put out 130 to 140 amps, no problem. Again, on 120 volt input. Now, if they would only go back and rate the rest of their lineup correctly. They get props for the DP200, but they still really need to correct the false specs of many of their other machines. I did verify that this unit does not have power factor correction. They never said it did, but I was kind of hoping they'd slipped it in there and just didn't make a fuss over it. But I measured the power factor, and I found that it bounced around the 0.5 to 0.6 or 0.7 range that's typical for a machine like this, at least when it doesn't have power factor correction. That means that when maxed out on 120 volts, it will draw around 40 amps from the wall, so don't expect even a 20 amp circuit to support a very long duty cycle when you have the unit maxed out. Running a 3/32 inch stick rod at 85 amps, the unit still draws around 28 amps on 120 volts. So it's definitely not going to be the most friendly to generators or low amperage circuits. Speaking of stick welding, the DP200 is one of the best stick welding machines Yeswelder has made. Starts are relatively easy even with the open circuit voltage reduction turned on, and the arc is pretty smooth. Unfortunately, even in the mode 4 6000 series rods, it doesn't run 6010 well. It would mostly stay running if I set it hot and kept the rod literally dragging against the work, but it still stuttered once in a while, and it would go out if I manipulated the rod or long arced even a little. I tried Lincoln 5P Plus in the metal can, and based on what some others have said, I also got some Lincoln 6010 rods in the plastic box with the red flux. But they ran almost exactly the same on the DP200. I know there are a lot of other 6010 brands out there, but as it stands, I don't think this machine is good for 6010. However, it did run 6011 just fine. And unsurprisingly, it also ran 6013, 7014, and 7018 with no problems. And since it has accurate, consistent amperage settings, I could switch rod types or sizes, dial in a setting, and start welding with no issues. It's certainly not the best or smoothest running stick welder out there, but the accurate and consistent amperage settings alone make it the nicest Yeswelder to stick weld with. Moving on to MIG, once again the simple fact that the output settings are accurate and consistent makes a big difference compared to some of their other machines. When welding steel with 0.30-inch wire, the synergic settings were fairly reliable as well. Though when set for really thin steel, the synergic settings seemed like they could use a little tweaking. Speaking of which, I would prefer the machine have the option of a full manual mode, but you can adjust the wire speed and voltage pretty far within the synergic mode, so it isn't too much of a limitation. But again, I would still prefer the option of a fully manual mode. But overall though, it's not a bad machine. If I had a project that needed done, I'd feel totally confident in grabbing this machine with some 0.30 wire and C25 gas. For welding steel, if you were hoping the pulse or dual pulse options would make this welder better for thin material, I didn't find that to be the case at all. First of all, you can only select pulse mode in conjunction with 0.35 or larger wire. Pulse welding is designed to be a spray process, and sure, pulsing might help control heat input versus a non-pulsed spray arc, but pulse is still spray arc, so it's still a hot process. With 0.30-inch wire and no pulse, I'm confident that I could run a bead of short arc MIG across a small piece of 14-gauge steel with no problem. In pulse mode, set for 14-gauge steel, a very quick bead across the same piece started melting the whole thing away about halfway across. Spray arc is just a hot process. Also, I only have C25 gas currently, and you are expected to have 90% argon for pulse mode to facilitate the spray arc. The only gas option on the machine, in fact, is 90% argon once you enable pulse on steel. So I'm going to go ahead and give the welder the benefit of the doubt and blame the fact that I didn't have the correct gas. But in dual pulse mode, the arc would drop out of spray every time the unit went to the background current, but since the voltage was still high, it would just kind of explode the wire and splash molten spatter all over the place. I could still get a decent looking bead some of the time, but I would personally never use dual pulse on this machine without 90% argon gas because the stuttering and spatter mess were kind of a nightmare. Still, pulse welding can be cool, but in general, I wonder if a lot of people are going to find that the pulse and dual pulse modes are less useful than they expected once they understand the limitations. For aluminum, I'll start by saying I've so far only tested it with 0.45-inch wire. I wanted to test out the pulse settings, and when set to weld aluminum with pulse turned on, the only selectable wire size is 0.45-inch. So that's what I used for all my aluminum testing. Well, technically I used 0.47-inch, which is the only size I've ever personally found anywhere. Not 0.45. Anyway, with that in mind, it was kind of terrible for thin aluminum. For 1/8-inch aluminum, it actually ran a bit smoother in pulse and dual pulse modes. I could get it to run okay without pulse, but it seemed like the voltage set by the machine was way too high. The wire would just burn back and make a giant arc plume with the default synergic settings. If I turned the voltage down, it ran okay. Just wanted to pop in here for a quick update. This is actually after I did all of the testing in the video and recorded all of it and was editing it. I just realized there was something else I never showed. I never actually showed the max output on MIG. I never actually recorded that. I tested it, I checked it. It can do what it says when maxed out on MIG on 240 volts, but I never actually showed a video of that. So I came out to the garage to get that video. Well, it had the liner in it and the wire and stuff for aluminum, so I thought, no big deal. I'll show it on aluminum. So I got some 3/8" aluminum. I set the machine to the synergic setting for 3/8" aluminum, and I went to run a bead, and it was just absolutely frustrating. It made me kind of mad. The setting is so far off that when this is set to the synergic setting for 3/8" aluminum on 240 volts with 045 wire, the voltage is so far too high that it just instantly, maybe not instantly, but within about a second, burns up into the gun and just completely nukes the contact tip. Gone, unusable, just completely melted into a blob of aluminum and copper. So I thought, maybe it was a fluke, maybe there was something going on. I tried again. I got a new contact tip, which took a while to get out of the end of the gun and get all set back up. And then I made sure the gas was correct, made sure it was flowing correct. I repurged everything. I made sure that the tension on the spool was set correctly and that the wire was moving correctly, nothing was binding. I made sure everything was correct. I tried again, and the exact same thing happened again, almost instantly, just grenaded the contact tip as soon as I started trying to weld. So obviously the synergic setting for 3/8" aluminum with 045 wire, just way out of whack. They definitely need to work on that. The default settings with pulse and dual pulse modes ran well on 1/8" aluminum, but it was just very hot. On 1/16" aluminum, I couldn't get it to run well at all without pulse. Again, it just seemed like the voltage was way too high. I had to turn the voltage down like 2.5 volts, and then it would run, but it was still finicky. I think this is probably due, at least in part, to trying to weld 1/16" aluminum with 047 wire. But interestingly, with pulse or dual pulse on, it actually ran okay on 1/16" aluminum. But again, it was just way too hot. Like hot enough that the crater, when you stop, actually blasts a hole through the metal. So for anything under 3/16" aluminum, my guess is that you'd be better off just using 030 or 035" wire and foregoing the pulse options. On thicker aluminum, it actually ran nice with or without pulse, though it still felt like the default settings were on the hot side. It might take a bit of testing to find the sweet spot on any particular thickness and joint configuration that you're working with, but at least on thicker material, a dual pulse frequency of, say, 2 Hz or so could allow for a consistent, smooth travel, while still getting those pleasing, uniform ripples. Ultimately, I don't see pulse or dual pulse being useful for thin material. For thicker material, I think it could be useful in some situations, but I don't think it would be a game changer for me. Still, it has it, and it mostly worked as described. Just be aware you may have to do some testing and tweaking to find the sweet spot for your particular project. I still don't have the foot pedal, so I'll leave the TIG testing for another time. Maybe at that time I'll try some thinner aluminum wire to see if the weirdness with the synergic settings on thin material is less of an issue with thinner wire. Overall, from what I've seen so far, I'd say, yeah, it's fine. On the plus side, the build quality is among the best Yeswelder has ever managed. It's still built like a cheap machine, but it's definitely designed and built with more care than a lot that I've seen, including from Yeswelder. The ratings and amperage settings are accurate, though Yeswelder does need to proofread their manuals. Its stick weld's pretty decent, and despite synergic defaults that aren't very good with some combinations of settings, it can be tweaked to run well in most situations I threw at it. Unfortunately, there are some things that hold it back from reaching the good performance and value category for me. It strikes me that much of what I can praise about this machine should have already been the bare minimum expectation. Yes, it meets the claimed specs, and the output settings on the machine aren't lies. But I really think that should be seen as the bare minimum expectation, right? Sure, it would lose points for being a box of lies, but it shouldn't gain points for simply not lying. It's just that the lies have become so common that I'm struggling not to heap praise on it for simply not lying to me. But I think I need to temper that a bit. I hope we can get to a point where it's like, no doy, of course it's not a box of lies. That would be ridiculous. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet. And while I appreciate the extra effort made with the internal ground wire, this is a basic electrical safety requirement, so having a proper ground should always be the bare minimum. But even this slight bit of effort seems praiseworthy, after the last Yeswelder I opened up had one of the most pathetically incompetent ground setups I've ever seen. Spoiler alert if this video comes out first, but that was actually the MiG-205DS that I'm also testing right now. As for the pulse modes, I understand the reasoning behind the limitations. But it still is a bummer that it's limited to 0.45-inch wire for aluminum and 0.35-inch wire for steel. It's also a shame that pulse is simply not available at all when running on 120 volts. Again, it's a spray process, so I get it. But it is still unfortunate. It's also unfortunate that it has a specific stick setting for 6000 series rods, but won't run 6010 well. And can we finally move past including the absolute bottom of the barrel welding cables and accessories? Normally I would say something like, yeah, they're not great, but they work. But I literally had to use the stick electrode holder and cable from the MiG-205DS because the electrode holder that came with the DP200 snapped the first time I squeezed the handle. Defects can happen, and I certainly wouldn't condemn a product just due to a defect, especially one like that. But this isn't a dirt cheap machine. It's currently on sale because of the pre-order, but it's eventually going to cost between $600 and $750. And this is the third welder that has raised literal millions of dollars for Yeswelder on Kickstarter. And yet it comes with the same cables, work clamp, and electrode holder that you'd get with an $80 machine from Amazon or AliExpress. So that's why I say it falls into, yeah, it's fine. It's a decent machine that has the output it claims. The pulse and dual pulse modes are cool, even if I don't think they'll be a game changer for most people. And it seems a pretty capable MIG welder, and is a stick welder on both 120 and 240 volts. As long as you know it's going to draw a lot of current on 120 volts. And maybe you'll consider the pros and cons and decide that for you, it does represent good performance and good value. And we'll see how it goes with TIG once my foot pedal finally arrives. Either way, I hope this marks a trend for Yeswelder moving away from the deceptively built and deceptively advertised machines. Hopefully, the DP200 is not just a fluke. If it's not just a fluke, and it does represent a genuine attempt to improve, then I implore them to correct the issue with the rest of their machines, even if that means taking some of them off the market. I spoke to them years ago on a phone call that they requested and arranged. They asked for my feedback, and I explained the problem I had with the deceptive output claims. At the time, they blamed their manufacturer, and they said they were working to fix it. They have gone years since then, continuing to sell new models that are designed, built, and marketed with false specs. And the machine interfaces show amperage settings that the machines are utterly incapable of providing. This machine definitely is a great step forward, and I appreciate it. But that history has definitely tainted their reputation for me. It would take quite a showing of acknowledgement of the problem and corrective action for me to believe they really care. We'll see. Fingers crossed. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.